Age of the Pelasgian Race. A race of people arrived from Asia, whom the Greek authors named in general Pelasgians and Terseni, occupied the biggest part of Europe even before the migration of the Greeks, Celts, and Germans to the lands of this continent. These Pelasgians had formed in ante-Hellenic times the most extended, most powerful, and most remarkable people, a nation who from a moral and material point of view had changed the face of archaic Europe. The Pelasgians appear at the front of all the historic traditions, not only in Helena and in Italy, but also in the regions from north of the Danube and the Black Sea, in Asia Minor, in Assyria, and in Egypt. They represented the original type of peoples, so-called Aryan, which introduced in Europe the first benefits of civilization. We find, even today, the traces of their ethnographic extension as well as their industrial activity on 3 continents of the ancient world, beginning from the mountains of Norway to the deserts of Sahara, from the sources of rivers Araxi and Oxus to the Atlantic Ocean. But their political history and the history of their civilization are lost in the night of time. The few who still preserve data about the Pelasgians showed this great and fine people only in the last period of its history, when its political independence had been lost almost everywhere, and when its name had started to disappear. And unfortunately, even these few fragmentary data which have remained from the Pelasgians are transmitted by those who had conquered them, destroyed them, persecuted them, and later calumniated them. So the history of their epoch of flourishing, of power and territorial extension in Europe, Asia, and Africa, the history of its empires and institutions, of its art and industry, has remained buried. The political history of especially the southern Pelasgians ends with the fall of Troy. From now on, while we still hear about these Pelasgians from around the Aegean Sea, are only simple mentions of few and scattered groups forced by their enemies to immigrate from one country to another in search of a new place to settle. For the Greek people, the Pelasgians are the oldest people on earth. Their race seemed to them so archaic, so superior in concepts, strong in will and deed, so noble in mores, and the Greek traditions and poems attributed to all the Pelasgians the epithet of divine. Homer, Iliad. Dionysius of Halicarnassus says the Pelasgians from near Dodona were considered as saints, and that nobody dared to go to war against them. This epithet meant people with supernatural qualities, similar to the gods, epithet which they in truth had deserved for their moral and physical qualities. The ancient world was dominated by the Turkish-speaking Turanians, and Turkish was the dominant language that the world was speaking. However, the world, i.e. Asia, Europe, Middle East, and North Africa, went through an upheaval where this ancient Turanian sky god, planet god, sun god, and moon god worshipping civilization was subjected to internal and external opposition by secretive religious cults and eventually toppled. These secretive cults, under the guise of religion, first captured the top hierarchy of the existing societies, most everywhere where they claimed to be the middleman between God and the public. Once in that supposedly reputable and reverend position, they captured the wealth of the country as well as the control of the country by politics and intrigue. This way, they were also controlling the kings of the country as well. They grew so powerful that they were not even subject to the laws of the country or the authority of the kings. They created a class system where they were at the top, and quite frequently they acted as kings themselves. These religious cult organizations and their members manufactured new languages from the existing Turkish language by way of altering the Turkish words and phrases. The manufactured words and languages looked and sounded totally different from the existing Turkish, but the original Turkish source text used for the manufacture of each word was not lost in the process. It remained embedded in a confused manner in the body of the new words. With this knowledge about languages, and with the meaning attributed to these non-Turkish words, many of the fabricated words can be deciphered, and the Turkish text material used for the formation of such words can be recovered. The Greeks had lost long ago the tradition about when, how, and from where they had come to the lands of Heleta. But they had a tradition that before them another people had ruled over the land occupied by them. A people who had reclaimed the swamps, drained the lakes, created new courses for rivers, cut the mountains, connected the seas, plowed the plains, founded cities, villages, and citadels, had an inspiring religion, and had erected altars and temples to the gods. And that those people were Pelasgians. And those people were Pelasgians. According to the ancient Greek traditions, the Pelasgians had dwelt in parts of Greece even before the two legendary floods which had flowed over Attica, Boeotia, and Thessaly, one in the times of King Ogyges, the other in the time of Deucalion, Herodotus, Apollodorus. Therefore, they had ruled over the Greek lands even before the times of Noah. At the time of the flood of Ogyges, Pheronius, the father of Pelasg, reigned over Argos, Vesuvius. A branch of Pelasgian people, the Archaeology, who inhabited the slopes and valleys at the center of Peloponnesus, had the tradition that they had been on Earth even before the moon had appeared in the sky. There we go. Apollodorus, Rhodius. Regarding this important tradition, the scholiast of Apollodorus Rhodius says, "It seems that the Archaeology have existed even earlier than the moon, as Exodus writes in his work. Herodotus and Theodorus writes that the moon had appeared in the sky a little earlier than the war of Hercules with the giants. Aristos of Chios and Diodorus of Chalcedon say the same thing in their books about origins. Finally, Ephor, and we got some goofy names, that's for sure. Ephor, one of the most diligent researchers of antiquity and lover of truth, who had lived in the 4th century BC, writes, "The tradition tells us that the Pelasgians had been the most ancient people who had ruled over Greece." Herodotus. Prehistoric civilization of the Pelasgian race. When the Pelasgians appeared for the first time in the land of Heleta, they did not find here, as traditions tell, but a wild population scattered through mountains and woods, living in caves, without a society, without laws, without religion, and without useful knowledge. Archaeology, brave and pastoral people. The oldest inhabitants of Heleta said that, as Pausanias tells, that the first man born on earth had been Pelasg. As Pausanias tells us, the first man born on earth had been Pelasg, a man distinguished for the size, the strength, and the beauty of his figure, who surpassed all the other mortals for the qualities of his spirit. That is, Pelasg, after starting to reign, had been the first to teach the people to build huts, to protect themselves from cold, rain, and heat. That he had taught the people to make clothes from sheepskins, and he had forbidden them to continue to eat leaves, roots, and weeds, out of which were dangerous for their health. that he had taught the people to stop eating any sorts of acorns, but only from oaks. And the ancient epic poet Asius writes about the Pelasgi that he had been born from the black earth on the high slopes of the mountains, to be the beginner of the mortal genus. Another representative of the ancient Pelasgian civilization had been the divine Prometheus, the son of Lapit, the son of Gaia. The poet Eschyl, in one of the most beautiful works of his, presents Prometheus explaining the benefits that he had brought to mankind. These people, says Prometheus, did not know either the art to build brick houses in the light of the sun, or the way to work the wood, but they dwelt underground in the dark of the caves, exactly like ants. They had no certain sign by which to know when winter came, when spring, the seasons of flowers came, when the sun, the season of fruit, came, but led a life from one day to another, completely lacking any knowledge, until I taught them to know the rising and setting of the stars. Things difficult to know. Apart from this, I taught them the system of all useful sciences. I discovered the writing and the way people could remember all the sciences. I was the first to yoke the animals, which could be used for transport. Nobody else but I have invented the sailing ships so that the people could cross the sea. Till now, if it happened that one fell sick, one died from lack of means of healing, until I showed them how to make medicines and how they can cure all the diseases. I have introduced various modalities of knowing the future. And finally, who could affirm to have discovered ahead of me the useful things hidden underground like copper, iron, silver, and gold? Pelasgi and Prometheus are personifications of the ancient Pelasgian culture, and everything they invented or created, according to traditions, belongs to the genus of the entire people. There also existed in Crete an old tradition of Pelasgian tribes, had been the first in that island to teach the people to form flocks of sheep and to domesticate other types of animals, pigs, goats, cattle, horses. That they had taught the people the art of throwing the spear, the Pelasgian national weapon, and to live in a community, a communal society, and especially that they had been the initiators of goodwill and the regular and moderate life Pador Siculus. The data we have about the ancient history of the Pelasgians correspond entirely with the facts presented by the archaeology of the Neolithic epoch. The Pelasgians appear, according to ancient historical traditions, as the same population as the Neolithics, who had introduced in Europe the first elements of civilization. See, I'm trying to see if there were giants, but I don't know. They had introduced in Europe the first elements of civilization, domesticated animals, and the cultivation of cereals, and a more advanced industrial art. Even the Neolithic pottery bears Pelasgian ornamental signs and mystical symbols. Greek traditions also attributed to the Pelasgians the first cult of the gods in Europe. It was especially said about the Archaeology that they had been the first to bring sacrifices and make religious ceremonies for the gods. As we know, the Greeks had borrowed their main divinities from the Pelasgians. Herodotus, Plato, and Ovid. The ancient Jove of the Romans held a stone in his hand instead of thunderbolts, and the Romans made the most solemn oaths on this Jupiter Lapis. Cicero. Even today, some parts inhabited by Romanians, the peasants swear, while holding a stone in their hand or touching it with the hand. Even in their oath rites, the Romans preserved until late the use of holy stones, of silex. So the fact is, from the historical point of view, before Greek and Egyptian civilization, a much older civilization had spread over Europe. This had been the moral and material civilization of the Pelasgian race, which had opened a vast scope of activity for the human genus. The influences of this Pelasgian culture had been decisive for the fate of the mortals on this earth. The Pelasgians were the real founders of our actual way of existence. And that is what we will be doing. 1. Regarding the Pelasgians, the following is a citing from a book entitled Prehistoric
Nicolae Densușianu
by Nicolae Densușianu, the Great Pelasgian Empire, the country of the first Pelasgian kings, the Oceanos Potamos region. Ancient historical traditions of the Greeks, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Assyrians mentioned a vast empire of the Pelasgian race, which in its epoch of power and greatness had extended over a great part of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But the history of these primitive Pelasgian times is shrouded in the veil of many legends and myths. The first kings of the Pelasgian race had excelled especially in their personal virtues, in their political merits, and for the blessings they bestowed on the human genus. They had been the first to gather in a society of families and tribes scattered through caves, mountains, and woods, to found villages and cities, to form the first states, to give their subjects laws, and to introduce their gentler customs to their way of living. Had they dedicated their entire activity towards a better existence, physical and intellectual, and in this way had opened a new way for the fate of humanity on this earth. In gratitude for these everlasting merits of theirs, these kings of the Pelasgian race had been deified and honored with religious cults, some after death, like Uranus and Saturn, and others while living, for example, Jove. The ancient Pelasgian theology had then considered these civilizing kings of the ancient world like the gods, even more like true gods, descended on earth from the sky. In their honor, it had erected temples and altars, had instituted sacrifices and feast days, had composed hymns, legends, and rites, had founded colleges of priests and oracles, and finally had eternized their names on the celestial vault, attributing them to certain constellations. In this way, these kings, who had lived mortal lives, began to be called gods. They became the heads of ancient religion and watched, even after their death, as glorious ancestors over their people. As soon as the divine nature of these kings, who had put the first foundations of human happiness, is proclaimed, their epoch begins to darken. Historical traditions, redacted by the priestly colleges, change in miraculous legends. Their beings are dogmatically brought in connection to the birth of the world more and more, and in this way their history becomes mythical, theological. And this guy, he wrote the book Prehistoric. He unveils a past almost entirely unknown, a glorious past for Dacia. For the people who lived in these places, who Densușianu proves are our direct ancestors. He knew profoundly the classics and mastered their language, and read them in original, so that he gives the right interpretation of texts formerly appeared with the wrong meaning, owing to the lack of knowledge of the translator. It is incredible and defies the imagination how he finds, to the last detail, in Romanian legends and ballads, ancient deeds described in ancient texts, starting with Homer himself. His argument is solid, well-grounded, extremely well-informed. He was accused of advancing hypothesis. The general essence of his theory is, in short, the following. Densușianu starts from the prehistoric man and gradually reconstitutes the biggest empire known to the ancient world, the Pelasgian Empire. He shows the extraordinary role played for the human civilization by this empire, owing especially to the deified kings Uranus and Saturn, and their wives Gaia and Rhea. He proves, it can't be said otherwise, that the entire, but absolutely the entire mythology so-called Greek, was born in the mountains of Dacia, between Buzet, these words, I'm sorry, I apologize, they're not words that I'm used to coming in contact with.
Butzau and the Iron Gates.
Butzau and the Iron Gates. The great temple of the world was on the peak of Amal in the Busegi Mountains. He proves that a principal branch of these Pelasgians spoke a language called by him Proto-Latin, which gave birth to Latin and the Neo-Latin languages. He shows how tribes of this empire, the basis of which he believes to have been mostly religious, composed mainly of shepherds and later by metal workers, descended and founded Troy, Messene, and Rome. Interesting. He tries to recreate the customs, belief, and language of these peoples and manages to explain countless historical facts which so far had been unclear. Nicolae Densușianu. He died in 1911. Only 1,120 pages from Prehistoric Dacia had been printed. The whole book, 1,152 pages, without the introduction and final conclusion, which were only in unfinished note form, could not be used afterwards. Dr. C.I. Estrati was asked by the executor of his testament to publish the rest of the pages and to write a preface for the whole work. The preface is 114 pages long, so I'll present it here in a much shortened form. You must not forget that the voice is Dr. Diastrantes, and the time of writing was 1912. Nicolae Densușianu was born at Densuș, a little Romanian village in Transylvania, at that time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not far from Sarmajevicuza, later Alpina Traiana, the former capital of Dacia, today's Romania. The legendary Pelasgian and Atlantean Empire, which is the common background beyond the Pelasgians for various cults and legends related to Sirius, Atlantis, the Garden of Hesperides, the lore about the eternal spring and paradise on earth, Poseidon, Palladium, Athena, Perseus, the Amazons, and Atlas. Various interrelated data and evidence disclose the existence of a prehistoric vast empire and a series of legendary kings who ruled over the known world throughout Africa, Europe, Asia, Valentia Straton, 1927. Let us present some of this evidence. The Egyptian high priest and master of secrets, Manetho from Sebennytos, in the Delta, 3rd century BC, had calculated a total length of 24,925 years for the three divine dynasties of the gods, the demigods, and the Mani, aka forefathers or spirits of the dead, who had ruled in the beginning over the plains of the Nile. The oldest surviving reference to Manetho's E.G. Typica is that of Jewish historian Josephus in his work Against Apion, Fragmenta Historicorum Grecorum, Historicorum Grecorium, Armenian version of Eusebius, Chronica, Manetho, from Cincillus, the Memphite theology, the Palermo and Cairo stone, the Turin royal canon, king list dated to 13th century BC. Then we should add another 5,264 for the following dynasties of mortal kings, according to Eusebius, beginning with Minos and ending with Artaxerxes Ochus. Finally, another 340 years, until the time of Augustus, when Christ was born. Thus, we have a total of 30,529 years to the beginning of our era. Researchers had already observed the difference between lunar and solar years, so the initial number of circa 25,000 years could be equivalent to 2,206 solar years. According to Manetho, the first king who had reigned over the valley of the Nile, predating even Ouranos, was Hephaestus, Vulcan, as the god of fire, of sun, and of light. In its temple in Memphis, the god was associated with a pygmy, Herodotus. In Homeric times, a colony of dwarves existed south of the mouth of the Danube, near the Black Sea. Pliny and Homer in the Iliad. Diodorus of Sicily mentions also the rule of the sun. Helios equals Uranus equals Uranus as the first deified king, along with Saturn, Cronus, who had ruled over the plains of the Nile. Moreover, he was considered the first king ruling over the regions near the Atlas Mountain, north of the Istru. The Atlantes, or inhabitants near the Atlas Mountain, near the Oceanos Patamos, according to Diodorus, excel among all the neighboring peoples for their particular piety and hospitality. In ancient Greek etymology, Uranus, as a personal name, derives from oros, with the Lonic suffix anos, meaning man from the mountain. His wife Gaia also had the epithet Orestera, according to Herodotus. Atlas was the name of a significant river which flew from the heights of Old Amos, Carpathians, and into the lower Istru, Van Goos, 1974. Importantly, Uranus was considered to be the first king of the Pelasgian race, appearing also under the name Pelasgos. There are 6 proposed etymologies for this name: becoming old, old man, voyager in the bird, stork, travel at sea equals the sea mariner, roam the sea, leader of the neighboring people. The size of his body, his strength and beauty surpassed that of all other mortals. Together with the gifts of his soul, he was the first to teach humans to build huts, to make clothes. He forbade them to continue eating green leaves, weeds, and roots, some of which were inedible, and others dangerous to their health, allowing them only the use of the acorn of the oak for eating. Pausanias 8. According to the cyclist Aeschylus, supplement woman, Pelasgos was the son of Gaia. According to the grammarian Apollodorus, Pelasgos was the forefather of the Titans. Other ancient authors, scholars of Pindar, mention that Pelasgos was the first ancestor of the Hyperboreans, near the Atlas Mount Apollodorus. According to Diodorus Siculus, Uranus' reign extended especially over the western and northern parts of the ancient world, especially at Dodona, one of the sacred Pelasgian cities. Uranus was also venerated under the name Zeus. Anaxi, Pallas Chicos, Jupiter Imperator Pelasgus. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles invokes him under his name. He was the lord over the mountains of Dodona. According to the ancient traditions, the reign of Uranus, Pelasgios, and its pastoral tribes had extended from northern Europe to the southern areas, and beyond the Mediterranean to the plains of the Nile. It is worth mentioning that the Pelasgians had been the only people of the ancient world to which was attributed a divine origin, probably due to their extraordinary intelligence, their mortal and physical qualities, and their amazing deeds and works. The second deified king was Saturn, who also reigned over Egypt, over the vast territory reaching from Libya to the Western Ocean. He was the main divinity of the population subjected to Carthage, and remained as the predominant cult and religion even after the Roman conquest. Diodorus, Dionysus, Halicarnassus, and in other African areas.